All right. We're going to continue on in the transcendental dialectic. We're still in the A version. We are at the considerations on the sum total of pure psychology in consequence of these paralogisms. Okay, let's see what the consideration of the sum total of the consequences. Okay. If we compare the science of the soul as the psychology of inner sense with the science of the body as a physiology of the objects of the outer senses, we find, besides many things which in both must be known empirically, this important difference, that in the latter science, the science of the body, many things can be known synthetically, a priori, from the mere concept of an extended and impenetrable being, while in the former, nothing can be known from the concept of a thinking being. The cause is this: though both are appearances, yet the appearances of the outer sense have something permanent and enduring, which supplies a substratum as the basis of its varying determinations, and consequently supplies a synthetic concept, namely that of space and of appearance in space, while time, the only form of our inner intuition, has nothing permanent, and enables us to know only the change of determinations, but not the determinable object. Right. Our body, external things, outer things, function in space as material things do. Time is very much different. It's our only inner sense, according to Kant. Yeah, that makes sense. So we're able to say a fair amount of things, maybe about, external material objects in the world, but not maybe so many things. I mean, a priori. Not so many things a priori about time, other than it kind of goes forward, I think is what he's saying. For in what we call the soul, there's a continuous flux, and nothing permanent, except it may be, if people will so have it, the simple I. So simple because this representation has no contents, and consequently no manifold, so that it seems to represent, or more accurately to designate, a simple object. If it should be possible to get any knowledge by pure reason of the nature of a thinking being, in general, then this I would have to be an intuition, which, by being presupposed in thought in general, before all experience, might as an a priori intuition supply synthetic propositions. But this I is neither an intuition nor a concept of any object. It is rather the mere form of consciousness which can accompany both kinds of representation, and can impart to them the character of knowledge, provided something else be given in intuition which supplies material for representation of an object. Thus we see what the whole of rational psychology as a science thus we see that the whole of rational psychology as a science surpassing the powers of human reason is impossible, and nothing remains for us but to study our soul under the guidance of experience, and to keep ourselves within the limits of questions which do not go beyond the line where their content can be supplied by possible inner experience. But although rational psychology is of no use in expanding our knowledge, but in general is made up of nothing but paralogisms, we cannot deny to it an important negative utility, if it does not pretend to be more than a critical investigation of our dialectical inferences as framed by our common and natural reason. So, it can outline the outer bounds of what we can investigate with pure reason, I assume is what he's going to say. What purpose can, indeed, be served by a psychology founded merely on pure principles of reason? Its chief purpose is doubtless to guard our thinking against our thinking self against the danger of materialism. This purpose, however, is achieved, as we have shown, by the concept which reason gives our thinking self. For so far as this concept from leaving us with the fear that if matter were removed, then all thought, and even the existence of thinking beings, would vanish, that it has, on the contrary, clearly shown that if we remove the thinking subject, then the whole corporeal world would have to vanish, because it is nothing but the appearance in the sensibility of our own subject and a certain kind of its representations. It is true that I do not thereby know this thinking self any better according to its properties, nor can I thus understand its permanence, or even the independence of its existence, from what we may conjecture to be the transcendental substratum of outer appearances. For the latter is just as unknown to me as the thinking self. But it is nevertheless possible that I may find reason, from other than merely speculative grounds, to hope for an independent and during all possible change of my state, permanent existence of my thinking nature. Okay. In that case, much will have been gained, though I am freely confessing my ignorance. I can nevertheless repel the dogmatic attacks of a speculative opponent, and show him that he can never know more about the nature of my subject, in denying the possibility of my expectations, than I can know in clinging to them. Fair. 3 dialectical questions, which form the real object of all rational psychology, and which cannot be answered except by means of the considerations in which we have just been engaged, are founded on this transcendental illusion of our psychological concepts, namely, 1. The question of the possibility of the community of the soul with an organic body, that is, of animality and the state of the soul in the life of the human being. 2. The question of the beginning of this communion, that is, of the soul in and before our birth. 3. The question of the end of this community, that is, the soul in and after death. The question of immortality. What I maintain is that all the difficulties which we imagine to exist in these questions, and with which, as dogmatic objections, people wish to give themselves an air of deeper insight into the nature of things than the common understanding can ever claim to have, rest on a mere illusion. This illusion leads them to hypostatize what exists merely in thought, and to accept it in the same quality as a real object outside the thinking subject. So they essentially turn the inner self, soul, whatever, into and give it the same qualities as material objects. In other words, they take extension, which is nothing but appearance, for a property of external thing that subsists even apart from our sensibility, and take motion as the effect of these things, taking place actually and in itself, and independently of our senses. For matter, the community of which the soul causes so much misgiving, is nothing but a mere form, or a certain mode of representing an unknown object by means of that intuition which we call the outer sense. In this way, yeah, I guess in describing the, outer sense or our experience of things in the world as appearances, it does make the outer world very consistent with like the inner world, which is pretty interesting and an attractive idea. There may well, therefore, be something outside us, which the appearance to which the appearance which we call matter corresponds. though in its quality as appearance, it is not outside us, but is merely within us as a thought, although this thought represents it through that outer sense as existing outside us. Yeah. It's crazy how much sense that made to me. Because it sounds like gibberish, but yeah, I get what he's saying. Matter, therefore, does not signify a class of substances totally heterogeneous and distinct from the object of inner sense, the soul, but only the distinct nature of the appearances of objects, unknown to us as they are in themselves, the representations of which we call outer, as compared with those which we assign to inner sense, although, like all other thoughts, these outer representations belong merely to the thinking subject. They possess, however, this illusory property that, since they represent objects in space, they detach themselves, as it were, from the soul and hover outside it. Yet the space itself in which they are intuited is nothing but a representation, of which no counterpart of the same quality can ever be found outside the soul. The question, therefore, is no longer of the community of the soul with other known substances of a different kind outside us, but merely of the connection of the representations of inner sense with the modifications of outer sensibility. Sorry, I'm going to reread that even though I'm in the middle of the sentence. The question, therefore, is no longer of the community of the soul with other known substances of a different kind outside us, right? But merely of the connection of the representations of inner sense with the modifications of our outer sensibility, and how these can be connected with one another according to constant laws as to acquire cohesion in experience. Okay. As long as we take inner and outer appearances together as mere representations in our experience, there is nothing that is absurd and that makes the community of both senses appear strange. As soon, however, as we hypostatize the outer... Should I look up hypostasis? I assume it's like a weird version of... kind of an archaic version of hypothesize, but... Hypostatize. Treat or represent something abstract as concrete in reality. Okay. That's different than what I said. As soon as, however, we hypostatize, learned a new word today, hypostatize, the outer appearances, and come back to look upon them no longer as representations, but as things existing by themselves outside us, with the same quality as that which they exist in us, and as referring to their actions, which they show as appearances in relation to one another, to our own thinking subject, then the efficient causes outside us assume a character which we cannot be reconciled with their effects in us. Okay. This is Aristotle shit, man. Efficient causes outside us assume a character which cannot be reconciled with their effects in us. For this character refers only to the outer senses, but the effects to inner sense, and although they are although they are united in the same subject, both senses are entirely heterogeneous. As soon as, however, we hypostatize the outer appearances, and come to look upon them no longer as representations, but as things existing by themselves outside us, with the same quality as that which they exist in us, and as referring to their actions which they show as appearances in relation to one another, to our own thinking subject, then the efficient causes... Oh, God, I gotta brush up on... Efficient cause is like the thing that causes something to do what it's supposed to do, isn't it? Oh, shit. I just put efficient. I forgot because. Agency or efficiency. An efficient cause consists of things apart from the thing being changed, which interact so as to be an agency of the change, right? For example, the efficient cause of a table is a carpenter acting on the wood, right? Okay. That's what I was thinking, but God, I don't know it well enough to say that confidently. Okay. Then the efficient causes outside us assume a character which cannot be reconciled with their effects in us. For this character refers only to the outer senses, but the effects to inner sense. But for this character refers only to outer senses. I think he's saying the hypostatization to outer senses, but the effects of the hypostasis to inner sense. And although they are united in the same subject, both senses are entirely heterogeneous. We then have no other external effects but alterations of place, and no forces but mere tendencies, which have relations in space as their effects. Within us, on the contrary, those effects are thoughts, among which there are not to be found any relations in place, motion, shape, or any spatial determination at all. So I think the upshot of what he's saying here is like, okay, if you posit if you posit external things as things in themselves, then you also have to posit internal things as things in themselves. Like, why would it be different? And if you're doing that, then what would be the difference between those two things? So they would have to, in effect, be pretty similar, but you can't. There's so many things in the external world and effects, or like whatever. Like, what did you say? Relations, etc., that could not possibly apply to the inner sense. So they must not be the same. I don't know. And we entirely lose the thread of the causes in the effects which ought to show themselves in inner sense. We ought to consider, however, that bodies are not objects in themselves which are present to us, but a mere appearance of we know not what unknown object, and that motion likewise is not the effect of this unknown cause, but only the appearance of its influence on our senses. Both the body and the motion are consequently not something outside us, but merely representations within us, and hence it is not the motion of matter which produces representations in us, but the motion itself, and also the matter which makes itself known through it, is representation only. Our whole self-created difficulty thus comes to this. Okay, this is exciting. How and why are the page turn representations of our sensibility so connected with one another that those which we call outer intuitions can, according to empirical laws, be represented as objects outside us? I was expecting him to say, okay, something slightly different. How and why are the representations of our sensibility so connected with one another that those which we call outer intuitions can, according to empirical laws, be represented as objects outside us? Okay. Not what I was expecting. A question which is entirely free from the imagined difficulty of explaining the origin of our representations from totally heterogeneous efficient causes outside us. Because they're appearances, right? This confusion arises from our mistaking the appearances of an unknown cause for the cause itself outside us. This confusion arises from our mistaking the appearances of an unknown cause for the cause itself outside us. In judgments in which there is a misapprehension that has taken root through long habit, it is impossible to make the correction at once, as clear as can be achieved in other cases, where no such inevitable illusion confuses our concept. Our attempt, therefore, at freeing reason from all these sophistical theories can hardly already claim that clarity which would render it perfectly satisfactory. I believe, however, to arrive at greater lucidity in the following manner. All objections may be divided into dogmatic, critical, and skeptical ones. A dogmatic objection attacks a proposition. A critical objection, the proof of a proposition. That makes sense. The former, dogmatic objection, requires an insight into the particular nature of the object in order to be able to assert the opposite of what the proposition asserts in regard to that object. The objection is therefore itself dogmatic and pretends to know the peculiar nature of the object in question better than the opponent. A critical objection, as it says nothing about the worth or worthlessness of the proposition and attacks only the proof, need not know the object itself better or claim a better knowledge of it. All it wants to show is that the assertion is not grounded, not that it is false. Make sense? A skeptical objection, lastly, places assertion and counter-assertion in mutual opposition as having equal value, taking each in turn as dogma, and the other as the objection thereto, and being thus in appearance dogmatic on both sides. It renders all judgment on the object null and void. Okay? Both the dogmatic, and skeptical objections must pretend to so much knowledge of their object as is necessary in order to assert or deny something about it. The critical objection, on the contrary, wishes only to show that something null and merely fanciful is presupposed in support of someone's assertion, and thus overthrows the theory by depriving it of its pretended foundation, without wishing to establish anything else about the constitution of the object. Okay. Let me check CNN really quick. Government shutdown starts in 36 minutes? 35 minutes and 28 seconds. Okay. I suppose I could have... wait, what? Colorado investigators to review author Hunter S. Thompson's death more than 2 decades after it was ruled a suicide? That would be fucking wild. I mean... He was like a gonzo reporter, right? It would kind of make sense if somebody wanted him dead. Anywho. According to the ordinary concepts of our reason, I've never read any Hunter S. Thompson. I kind of reject. I don't know. When people think stuff is cool, I'm kind of just like, I don't know. Stupid. Who cares? You know what I mean? He was seen as like just this cultural icon, and like, I don't know. It was a cool thing to read when I was an undergrad, and so I was just like, no, too cool for that. Too cool for the cool stuff. I need like the obscure, dumb stuff that people don't like. That's what's cool. Anywho, according to the ordinary concepts of our reason with regard to the community in which our thinking subject stands with the things outside us, we are dogmatic and look upon them as real objects, existing independently of ourselves, in accordance with a certain transcendental dualism which does not assign outer appearances to the subject as representations, but places them just as they are given to us by sensible intuition, as objects outside us and entirely separated from the thinking subject. This subreption is the foundation of all theories on the community between soul and body. It is never asked whether this objective reality of appearances is absolutely true, but it is taken for granted, and the only question seems to be how this is to be explained and understood. The three systems, which are commonly suggested and which in fact are the only possible ones, are those of physical influence, of predetermined harmony, and of supernatural assistance. Okay. What's he talking about? The second and third explanations of the community of soul and matter arise from objections to the first. So predetermined harmony and supernatural assistance arise from objections to physical influence, which is that of common sense. The objection is that what appears as matter cannot by its immediate influence be the cause of representations, these being a totally heterogeneous class of effects from matter. Right. Talking about the difference between mind and body, right? Soul and matter, yeah. So matter cannot influence soul and vice versa because they're just completely different. One's physical, one's non-physical. Where do they meet? Those who raise this objection cannot attach to what they mean by an object of outer sense the concept of matter that is nothing but appearance. Because then there conceivably could be some connection. At least there's no reason there couldn't be. Because everything's an appearance. And therefore, in itself, a mere representation produced by whatever external objects. For otherwise, they would be saying that the representations of external objects, appearances, cannot be external causes of the representations in our mind. Ooh, interesting. Which would be an entirely meaningless objection because nobody would think of taking for an external cause what he has once recognized as a mere representation. According to our principles, the aim of their theory can only be the claim that that which is the true transcendental object of our outer senses cannot be the cause of those representations, appearances, that we mean by the word matter. As no one has any right to say that he knows anything of the transcendental cause of the representations of our outer senses, their assertion is entirely groundless. And if the pretended reformers of the doctrine of physical influence regarded, according to the ordinary views of transcendental dualism, matter, as such, as a thing in itself, not simply as a mere appearance of an unknown thing, and if they proceeded in their objections to show that such an external object, which shows in itself no causality except that of motions, can never be the efficient cause of representations, but that a third being must intervene in order to produce, if not reciprocal action, at least correspondence and harmony between the two, then they would really begin their refutation by admitting their dualism. Oh, God. What line? Is that Russian? What the fuck? No. What? 36. Footnote 36. Um. 36. Proton pseudos, first falsity. Is that like ancient Greek or something? I don't understand. Of physical influence, and thus would refute by their objection not so much their natural influence as their own dualistic presupposition. Isn't that what Descartes' answer was? Like just God? How do you connect mind to body? God does it every time. Didn't he also have like a weird theory of like some gland in your brain or some shit that didn't really work out? Anyway, for all the difficulties with regard to a possible connection between our thinking nature and matter arise, without exception, from that too readily admitted dualistic concept, namely, that matter, as such, is not appearance. That is, mere representation of the mind to which an unknown object corresponds, but is the object in itself as it exists outside us and independently of all sensibility. It is impossible, therefore, to raise a dogmatic objection against the commonly accepted theory of physical influence, because you don't know. For if the opponent were to say that matter and its motions were mere appearances, and therefore mere representations, the only difficulty remaining to him would be that the unknown object of our sensibility cannot be the cause of our representations. That the unknown object of our sensibility cannot be the cause of our representations. And why not? And he has no right to say, because no one is able to determine, right, what an unknown object may or may not be able to do. Right. And he must, according to what we have just proved, necessarily concede this transcendental idealism, unless he wishes to hypostatize representations and place them outside himself as real things. Yeah. Okay. What is quite possible, however, is to raise a well-founded critical objection. Here we go. To the common accepted opinion of a physical influence. For the supposed community between two kinds of substances, the one thinking, the other extended, rests on a coarse dualism, and turns extended objects, though they are nothing but mere representations of the thinking subject, into things existing by themselves. Right? Thus, the misunderstood physical influence may be entirely invalidated by showing that the proof of it is surreptitiously obtained and void. The notorious problem, therefore, as to a possible community between the thinking and the extended would, when all that is merely imaginative is separated, come to this. How is outer intuition, namely that of space, or what fills space with shape and motion, possibly in any thinking subject? To this question, however, no human being can find an answer. And instead of attempting to fill this gap in our knowledge, all we can do is indicate it by ascribing outer appearances to a transcendental object, an object which is the cause of this kind of representation. But of which we shall never have any knowledge, and which we shall never be able to form any concept. In all problems which may arise in the realm of experience, we treat outer appearances as objects in themselves without troubling ourselves about the primary ground of their possibility as appearances. But as soon as we go beyond these limits, the concept of a transcendental object becomes necessary. Not sure I understand the transcendental object, but the settlement of all the disputes and objections concerning the state of a thinking nature before this community with matter, before life, or after the cessation of such community, in death, depends on the remarks which we have just made about the community of the thinking and the extended being. The opinion that the thinking subject was able to think before any community with bodies would assume the following form. That before the beginning of this kind of sensibility, through which something appears to us in space, the same transcendental objects, which in our present state appear as bodies, could have been intuited in a totally different way. The other opinion, that after the cessation of its community with the corporeal world, the soul can continue to think, would be expressed as follows: that if the kind of sensibility through which transcendental and for the present entirely unknown objects appear to us as a material world should cease, then it would not follow that thereby all intuition of them would be removed. And it is quite possible that the same unknown objects should continue to be known by the thinking subject, although no longer in the quality of bodies. Okay? Now, it is quite true that no one can produce from speculative principles the smallest ground for such an assertion, or do more than merely presuppose its possibility. But neither can any valid dogmatic objection be raised against it, for whoever would attempt to do so would know neither more nor less than I myself, or anybody else, about the absolute and inner cause of outer and corporeal appearances. As he cannot pretend to know on what reality of outer appearances in our present state in life rests, neither can he know that the condition of all outer intuition, or even the thinking subject itself, will cease after this state in death. We thus see that all the wrangling about the nature of thinking, of a thinking being, and its connection with the corporeal world arises simply from our filling the gap in regard to something of which we are wholly ignorant. The wrangling about the nature of a thinking being and its connection with the corporeal world arises simply from our filling the gap in regard to something of which we are wholly ignorant, with paralogisms of reason, and from thereby turning thoughts into things and so hypostatizing them. On this, an imaginary science is built up, both by those who assert and by those who deny. For each of them either pretends to know something about objects, in which no human being has any concept, or turns his own representations into objects and thus spins around in a constant circle of ambiguities and contradictions. Nothing but a sober, strict, and just criticism can free us of this dogmatic illusion, which, with theories and systems, deceives so many people through the imagined happiness it offers. This criticism alone can limit all our speculative pretensions to the sphere of possible experience, and it does not do this by a shallow scoffing at the repeated failures or by pious sighs over the limits of our reason, but by a determination of the limits of reason made according to well-established principles, inscribing the nihil ulterius with perfect assurance on those pillars of Hercules which nature herself has erected, in order that voyage of our reason should be continued only as far as the continuous coasts of experience extend, coasts which we can never forsake without venturing out upon a shoreless ocean, which, after offering us deceptive prospects again and again, compels us in the end to abandon all our laborious and tedious endeavors as utterly hopeless. Good gravy, Kant. Okay. It's pretty good prose there. Okay. Where are we going to? Okay, we have a new section, just some asterisks in between. We have yet to give a general and clear exposition of the transcendental and yet natural illusion in the paralogisms of pure reason, as well as the justification of our systematic arrangement of them, which runs parallel to the table of categories. We could not have done this at the beginning of the section without running the risk of becoming obscure or inappropriately anticipating our arguments. We shall now try to fulfill our duty. Okay? All illusion may be explained as taking the subjective condition of thought Is that the cat snoring? I think it's a cat snoring. All illusion may be explained as taking the subjective condition of thought to be knowledge of the object. In the introduction to the Transcendental Dialectic, we showed that pure reason is occupied exclusively with the totality of the synthesis of the conditions for a given conditioned. The pure reason is occupied exclusively with the totality of the synthesis of the conditions for a given conditioned. Okay. Now, since the dialectical illusion of pure reason cannot be an empirical illusion, such as occurs in determinate empirical knowledge, it will refer only to what is universal in the conditions of thought, so that there can be only three cases of dialectical use of pure reason. 1. Synthesis of conditions of a thought in general. 2. Synthesis of the conditions of empirical thought. 3. Synthesis of the conditions of pure thought. So there's a synthesis of the conditions of a thought in general, synthesis of the conditions of empirical thought, synthesis of the conditions of pure thought, empirical thought. Okay. In every one of these three cases, pure reason is occupied merely with the absolute totality of the synthesis. That is, with that condition which is itself unconditioned. Okay, in every one of these three cases, pure reason is occupied merely with the absolute totality of this synthesis. That is, with that condition which is itself unconditioned. On this division is also founded the threefold transcendental illusion, which leads to the three sections of the dialectic. The threefold transcendental illusion, which leads to the three sections of the dialectic, and so to just as many pretended sciences flowing from pure reason, namely transcendental psychology, cosmology, and theology. We are at present concerned only with the first, psychology, right? Since in thought in general we abstract from all relation of our thought to any object, whether of the senses or of pure understanding, the synthesis of the conditions of a thought in general is not objective at all, but merely a synthesis of the thought with the subject, which synthesis is wrongly taken for the synthetic representation of an object. Okay? It follows from this that the dialectical inference to the condition of all thought in general, a condition which is itself unconditioned, does not involve an error in contents, for it abstracts from all content or objects, but an error in form alone, and must therefore be called a paralogism. Okay, it follows from this that the dialectical inference to the condition of all thought in general, a condition which is itself unconditioned, does not involve any error in contents. It can't. It kind of doesn't really involve content, or it involves so much content that the content can't be wrong, for it abstracts all content or objects, but an error in form alone, and must therefore be called a paralogism. An error in form, okay. As, moreover, the only condition which accompanies all thought is the I, the only condition which accompanies all thought is the I, in the universal proposition I think, reason deals with this condition insofar as the condition is itself unconditioned. It is, however, only a formal condition, namely the logical unity of every thought. Right, the logical unity of every thought includes the I think, like that's the implied, in which I abstract from any object. But nevertheless, it is represented as an object which I think, namely, I myself and the unconditioned unity of this I. If I were asked, what is the constitution of a thing which thinks? I cannot a priori know in the least how to reply, for the answer ought to be synthetic, since an analytic answer might perhaps explain what thought is, but can never add any knowledge of that on which the possibility of thought depends. For a synthetic solution, however, we should require intuition. And this intuition has been entirely left out of the account in the general form given to our problem. It is equally impossible to answer in its general form the question, what must a thing which is movable be? For in this case the impenetrable extension, matter, is not given. But although I have no general answer to this question, it does seem that I could answer in a special case, namely, in the proposition which expresses self-consciousness, I think. For this I is the first subject, i.e., substance. It is simple, etc. These, however, ought to be propositions of experience which nevertheless, without a universal rule containing the a priori conditions of the possibility of thought in general, could not contain such predicates which are not empirical. Through this consideration, our insight, which seem at first so plausible that we can make judgments about the nature of a thinking being and can do so from concepts alone, becomes extremely suspect, although we have not yet discovered the error it contains. I'll be honest with you, this is not making a lot more sense than I think it would have at the beginning. A further investigation, however, of the origin of the attributes which I ascribe to myself as a thinking being in general may help us discover this error. There are no more than pure categories through which I can never think a determinate object, but only the unity of representations which is requisite in order to determine an object. They are no more than pure categories through which I can never think a determinate object. Right, the pure categories don't give us an object necessarily, but only the unity of representations which is requisite in order to determine an object. So once I get an object, I use the categories in order to define it effectively or experience it. Without the underlying intuition, no category by itself can give me a concept of an object. For through intuition alone, the object is given, which thereupon is thought in accordance with the category. In order to declare a thing to be a substance in appearance, predicates of its intuition must first be given to me. In order to declare a thing to be a substance in appearance, predicates of its intuition must first be given to me, by which I distinguish the permanent from the changeable, and the substratum, the thing itself, from that which merely adheres to it. If I call a thing simple in appearance, then what I mean is that its intuition is part of appearance, but cannot itself be divided into parts, etc. But if I know something to be simple in the concept only, and not in appearance, then I have really no knowledge whatever of the object, but only of my concept, which I make for myself, of a something in general that does not allow of an actual intuition. That kind of makes sense. So like if I know something about an object because I know of the general concept related to it, but I can't perceive it in the object, I don't necessarily know anything about that object. I just know something about the concept related to that object. I then only say that I think something as perfectly simple because I have really nothing to say of it except merely that it is something. Now, the mere apperception, the I, is substance in concept, simple in concept, etc. And in this sense, all the psychological doctrines of which we spoke before are incontestably true. Nevertheless, what we really wish to know of the soul becomes by no means known to us in this way, because none of those predicates are valid with regard to any intuition whatsoever. And so they also entail no consequences with regard to the objects of experience, and therefore they are entirely empty. For this concept of substance does not teach me that the soul continues by itself, or that it is part of outer intuitions, which itself cannot be divided into parts, and so cannot arise or perish through any alterations in nature. These are all properties which would make the soul knowable to us in the context of experience, and might give an insight into its origin and future state. But if I say, through the mere category, that the soul is a simple substance, then it is clear that the understanding's bare concept of substance contains nothing more than a thing that should be represented as a subject in itself, without in turn becoming a predicate of anything else. Nothing therefore follows from this concept with regard to the permanence of the soul, nor can the attribute of the simple add this permanence. Hence we cannot thus learn anything whatsoever as to what may happen to the soul in the alterations of the world. That makes sense. If anybody could tell us that the soul is a simple part of matter, we might, with the help of experience, derive from this the permanence, and on account of its simple nature, the indestructibility of the soul. But of all this, the concept of the I in the psychological principle, I think, tells us nothing. The reason why the being, which thinks in us, imagines that it knows itself through pure categories, and especially through those which express absolute unity under each heading of categories, is this. Apperception itself is the ground of the possibility of the categories, and these represent nothing but the synthesis of the manifold of intuition, insofar as this manifold has unity in apperception. Self-consciousness in general is therefore the representation of that which forms the condition of all unity, and is itself unconditioned. Gotta reread that, sorry. Self-consciousness in general is therefore the representation of that which forms the condition of all unity. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. And is itself unconditioned. One may therefore say of the thinking I, the soul, which regards itself as substance, simple, numerically identical in all time, and as the correlate of all existence, from which, in fact, all other existence must be inferred, that it does not know itself through the categories, but knows the categories, and through them all objects, in the absolute unity of apperception, and so knows them through itself. Yeah, I get it. It may seem, no doubt, very evident that I cannot know as an object that which is presupposed by me in order to know an object, and that the determining self, the thought, is distinct from the determinable self, the thinking subject, in the same way as knowledge is distinct from its object. Nevertheless, nothing is more natural, or at least more tempting, than the illusion which makes us look upon the unity of the synthesis of thoughts as a perceived unity in the subject of these thoughts. Yeah. Meaning like the unity of apperception that we talked about in the transcendental analytic also, I mean, it's tough to see that like experience needs to be unified in this in a single being, and then from that not draw the conclusion that other things should be similarly interpreted, or like that the self is like the center of other things. One might call it the subreption of the hypostatized consciousness, apperceptionis substantiati. All right, I gotta turn the dryer on. If we want to have the logical title for the paralogisms and the dialectical inferences of rational psychology, which are based on perfectly correct premises, it might be called a sophisma figura dictionis. In the major premise, we use the category with regard to its condition, merely transcendentally. In the minor premise, and in the conclusion, we use the same category with regard to the soul, which has been subsumed under this condition empirically. Thus, in the paralogism of substantiality, the concept of substance, for instance, is a purely intellectual concept, which, without conditions of sensible intuition, admits merely of the transcendental use, that is, of no use at all. In the minor, however, we refer to the same concept to the object of all inner experience, though without having previously established the condition of its application in concreto, namely the permanence of this object. We are thus making an empirical, and in this case inadmissible, use of the concept. Lastly, in order to show the systematic coherence of all these dialectical assertions of a sophistical psychology in a coherence of pure reason, and thus to establish their completeness, it should be remarked that apperception is carried through all the classes of the categories, but only for those concepts of the understanding which in each class form the foundation of the unity of the others in a possible perception, namely, for subsistence, reality, unity, not plurality, and existence, all of which are here represented by reason as conditions, which are themselves unconditioned, of the possibility of a thinking being. Thus, the soul knows... I gotta reread that. What? I was thinking about just powering through, but I think I have to. Okay. Lastly, in order to show the systematic coherence of all these dialectical assertions of a sophistical psychology in a coherence of pure reason, made up stuff, and thus to establish their completeness, it should be remarked that apperception is carried through all the classes of the categories. Okay, that makes sense. But only for those concepts of the understanding which in each class form the foundation of the unity of the others in a possible perception, namely, for subsistence, reality, unity, and existence, all of which are here represented by reason as conditions, which are themselves unconditioned, of the possibility of a thinking being. It just doesn't feel like a complete sentence. Thus the soul knows in itself, we got a nice table. 1. The unconditioned unity of the relation, that is, it knows itself, not as in hearing, but subsisting. 2. The unconditioned unity of the quality, that is, it knows itself, not as a real whole, but as simple. 3. The unconditioned unity of in the plurality of time, that is, it knows itself not as being at different times numerically different, but as the one and the same subject. 4. The unconditioned unity of the existence in space, that is, it knows itself not as the consciousness of many things outside it, but as the consciousness of the existence of itself only. and of other things merely as representations. Okay? Reason is the faculty of principles. Okay? The assertions of pure psychology do not contain empirical predicates of the soul, but contain those predicates, if there be any such, which are meant to determine the object in itself independently of experience, and therefore through mere reason. They ought therefore to rest on principles and on universal concepts of thinking, natures in general. Instead of this, we find that the singular representation, I am, governs them all. This representation, for the very reason that it expresses, indeterminately, the pure formula of all my experience, claims to be a universal proposition valid for all thinking beings. And since it is nevertheless in all respects singular, it carries with it the illusion of an absolute unity of the conditions of thought in general, thus stretching further than possible experience can reach. Hold on. That's all I'm going to read for tonight, but I need to reread that. So the I am. He's talking about the I am. This representation, for the very reason that it expresses indeterminately the pure formula of all my experience. Right. The I am expresses all my experience, because it's all collected within me, claims to be a universal proposition, valid for all thinking beings. And since it is nevertheless in all respects singular, it carries with it the illusion of an absolute unity of the conditions of thought in general, thus stretching further than possible experience can reach. Okay. Yeah, I feel pretty good about that. Yeah, that was great. I feel like I got most of that. That was not the most challenging stuff that we've encountered in the critique by far. So yeah, next I'll take on the B Paralogisms section, which is, I don't know, it's tough to tell, but it's like on page 321 to 377, but it's like a quarter of each page, roughly. So that would be 50 pages. A quarter of 50 pages is roughly, 13 pages, 12 pages, 12 and a half. So yeah, we'll do that next.